Connectedness is more important than ever, but it's not just about linking up on LinkedIn. It's about being an expert in the workplace and outside. And today we're joined by an expert in networking, Helen Nicholson. How are you, Helen?
It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. I've got the shirt on, which is a saying that we have at I2, which is behind every great thinker. And I was just thinking about networking, thinking behind every great thinker is an extrovert friend saying, let's get out there. This is the dichotomy that exists within the world. It's the extroverts and the introverts, although there's a bit of a spectrum in between. I myself, I'm sitting here with you. We're having this chat. We've never met before. So you'd think, I would be perceptive to a certain side, but I consider myself an introvert, which no one ever believes. And I find that introverts do definitely have to defend themselves about their positioning because they think, oh, but you're okay to speak to people and you know a lot of people. How did you come about this interest in introversion and the necessity for introverts to get a platform to know about networking?
So we have done a lot of leadership development work in financial services specifically. And over the years, I've noticed and have trained a lot of introverts because there are a lot of introverts in those deep technical positions. Mm-hmm. And I had a hunch that introverts were actually better networkers than extroverts. Because when I watch people in action, and the research kind of supports this, is two of the biggest networking skills are listening and following up. And I speak as an extrovert, often listening and following up are not extroverts' natural strengths.
Really?
So because extroverts are often too busy talking and they get energized by the interaction, yes, but they don't follow up. They'll lose the contact details and forget to follow up because they're very much onto the next interaction. And when I noticed some introverts in action, I saw that, they had a thoughtfulness around the way in which they engage with people. They listened a lot more attentively. And even if they connected with one or two people at an event or a function, and they followed up with those people, that is a lot more powerful than the extrovert who acts like a social butterfly, air kissing people and running around handing out contact details, right, but then never follows up. So during COVID, I put this to the test. So it was a hunch, and then I started to do the research. Mm-hmm. So I interviewed 253 introverts, and I divided them into two groups. One was people who felt happy and productive and fulfilled in their career, who identified as more introverted.
Yes.
And the other group were introverts who were feeling stuck and weren't feeling that they were achieving their career goals. And they were pretty much an equal bunch. And then I asked them some questions. And what I found is that my hunch was actually correct, that introverts can be exceptional connectors and networkers if, and there is a big if, mm-hmm, in capital letters here. ... If they get things like leaning into their natural strengths more, developing a personal brand deliberately, becoming a better storyteller. So those were kind of some of the things that if I looked at the successful introverts and the people who were feeling fulfilled, those were some of the things that they had done, often unconsciously, but it had led to career fulfillment and success for them.
You can't live without it, especially in the world that we live in now, where people are very conscious about the spheres of influence that they potentially need to be in to progress. I do think that there's potentially a little bit of a prejudice towards introverts because of that not necessarily being interested in the after work drinks or the hangouts on the golf course, potentially those kinds of things. Is it a case to say that in your research, people have been held back quite a bit in climbing maybe the corporate ladder or being invited into the room because they're not necessarily the greatest at networking?
Yes, I think the corporate world is very much constructed around an extrovert mindset. Mm. And that was also one of the reasons why I did the research and wrote the book. And part of the feedback I'm getting from introverts is I've given them confidence and a toolkit to actually go out there because they do need to do some work in this area. I always say it's networking, not net sitting. So the neuroscience of introversion and extroversion is fascinating. So dopamine is our feel-good chemical in our brain. It's what gets activated by social media. It's what, when someone likes or shares your posts, you get a little dopamine
a rush
hit. Exactly. Yeah. And when you look at the MRI brain scans of introverts and extroverts, introverts have actually got more dopamine receptors than extroverts. So if you imagine dopamine as a cup, so the introvert's dopamine cup is already quite full when they arrive at an event.
Okay.
So that's why they don't need a lot of stimulation to get the cup.
You're at an
to
even
reach
keel.
Exactly. So I always say to introverts, if you go to an event and you meet two people, you've done well. And if you listen attentively, connect with them meaningfully, and follow up, you've done amazing networking. Whereas if an extrovert goes to an event, their dopamine receptors, they have less of them. That means their dopamine cup is only kind of a quarter full. So that's why when they go to an event, they've got to socialize quite a bit more to fill up their cup.
Until their cup runneth over.
Exactly. And, it was so interesting because while I was researching this subject, my husband and I went to a party, and I'm more extroverted and he's more introverted. And that we'd had quite a social week, and I could see that he was feeling socialized out as we arrived. And he said to me, I'm not going to stay long. I could actually, what gave me compassion and insight into the mind of an introvert is that it's actually a neuroscience issue. It's not a choice, because his dopamine was almost full. So he stayed for kind of 45 minutes, an hour, and then he went home. But me as the extrovert, my dopamine cup was not full. And so I needed to stay for longer. Right. And we both understood that about each other. So there was no negative feeling, because often I think introverts can resent extroverts and vice versa at functions because we don't have that insight about each other.
Or when's the right time? Because
exactly.
So what I've understood previously, just from my high level understanding, and I think it's also good to understand that spectrum a little bit, because the word ambivert comes up a lot. I think also for people like me who appear to, be engaging with people and have a specific way to go about things, but genuinely when I'm by myself, I recharge.
Yes.
And how does that work in terms of the social battery? Because what you're saying is that the introverts' cup is full, but I was thinking when I'm in a social setting, my battery is draining actually.
Yes. Well, if you imagine if you imagine your cup as 100 milliliters, when you go into that event, you already at 80 milliliters. So you don't need a lot of stimulation to get to your 100. And at your 100, then you're done.
Okay.
So that's when, so I always say to introverts, arrive at events early and leave early. Because at the early, when an event, it's very intimidating. And that came out very clearly in my research, was for an introvert to arrive at an event that's already, fully in flow. There's a lot of people there. They don't like walking into an event that's just got tons of people. Whereas if they arrive early, then there are other like minglers that are early as well. And then they can start having chats. So they can actually network before the event has even begun. And then if they're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, then they can actually leave because they've done their work.
We have this conversation often in the sense that people do need to expand. We're in the world of insurance. Relationships are tops, and particularly within this organization at i2, we put relationships first, internal relationships and relationships with our brokers and clients. A lot of the time, the feedback, especially not necessarily from introverts, but people new to this industry, it's just awkward. You're walking up to a person that you've never met, you've never had a connection, and now you're supposed to invest so much into what they do. What have you found are some of the tips and tricks that you can give to people just to get over that hump of feeling like, I can't really just go up to a stranger, can I?
Yeah, so I think the two things to cultivate, and that actually introverts are very good at, is curiosity and research.
Okay.
So one of the best networking introverts I interviewed, she said to me that she has to go to a lot of conferences and a lot of events as part of her work. But she says she does a lot of research beforehand as to who's going to be there. And that would be one of my tips in the insurance industry. Before you go to a conference or an event, look at the guest list and decide and be a lot more strategic about who do you need to meet, because otherwise networking becomes spray and pray, whereas I'm into mindful, intentional connecting and networking with people. So have a look through the guest list. See there are 2 or 3, 4 or 5 people that you need to connect with. Connect with them on LinkedIn first.
Okay.
And then once they've accepted that, so this must all happen, in the week before the event, and then send them a mail. And what she does, which I think is an amazing technique, she always wears pink glasses. And she sends him a message, and she said, I'm actually more introverted, but I will be the person wearing the pink glasses at the event. And so she creates a pull effect. So in other words, she's been strategic. So she's done her research, and she also has looked at their LinkedIn profile. She's looked at, them on social media. So she's got an idea of what their interests are.
Okay.
So immediately she can have a meaningful conversation with them because she already knows something about them.
You're
and
empowering yourself at the end of the
Exactly.
day to make that scenario not seem as daunting.
Exactly.
It's such an interesting thing because I think a lot of us perceive it to be we're born a specific way and we're always going to be that way. I wanted to get your thoughts on the fact that in the book you mentioned, and the book is called Networking for Introverts. You're working on other material as well, which we'll get into. The benefits of the networking is not necessarily just in terms of the corporate world, it's in your personal life as well. A network is always going to be able to assist you, or you'll be able to be assisted a lot easier if you know the right people in the right places. Being that we're in a country where majority of the population is actually working class. So if you're middle class or you come from a family that can have access to a lot of things, you may find that your network is a little bit easier to build because maybe you're in better schools, or you're able to have vacation friends, or involved in extracurricular activities, things like that. In a country like South Africa, where people are mostly struggling, how do you not benefit from the fact that you don't have access to specific spaces? How can you still benefit from networking if you didn't come from a privileged background?
So I grew up in a family where my parents didn't know people who knew people. My mother was a retired school teacher. My father was an artist, and they had no networks. And they also were completely oblivious as to the power of networks.
Yes.
So, and I remember when I was little, this would manifest when we had a household repair to be done. Like, they had no personal referrals or recommendations to make about a service provider to come and fix the roof. And they would consult the old-fashioned yellow pages.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember that brick the telecom used to drop off, and they would page through it and they'd find a service provider. And there was definitely a connection in my family of lack of finances with lack of connections. And it was only later when I started to study networks that I realized there's a link. Because the more connected you are, often there's an ease in terms of the way in which you run your life. And I was at school with a friend of mine whose father had been to one of those boys' schools that, where the boys actively help each other. And, he's in his late 80s now, and he still is leveraging that school network.
Your alumni,
So they were together at school for 18 years, but in his late 80s, that network still serves him.
Incredible.
Literally for 60 years later. So, what makes me excited about this skill is I didn't grow up with parents who were networkers or connectors, and yet I've made my life's work around networks and connecting. And what is exciting about this skill is that it can be learned. And I think the currency of great networking and connecting is abundance and generosity. And it doesn't matter what your background is. Anyone can operate with an open palm. When you start to try and add value, wherever you meet someone, whatever relationship you're wanting to cultivate, instead of wanting to take, because that becomes very transactional. But when you approach life with an open palm, and there's got to be kind of a trust and a faith in that. It's actually, in many ways, networking, I believe, is deeply spiritual, because your personal brand is you fulfilling your purpose. Is I know that I was put on this earth to see the lights go on in people's eyes when they learn something. And then they go out and do something with that skill. And then they come back to me later and say, like, wow, that made such a difference. I love doing that. And so when you excavate your personal brand and then you communicate it to your network, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, that for me is the purpose of our lives. We were put on this earth to serve. And when you start approaching networks with an open palm, then amazing stuff starts to happen. Because a lot of people think, what can I take? When what they should be thinking, what can I give? And anyone can learn that.
That is beautiful. To find the meaning in this human connection, in relationships and people, as opposed to thinking, how is this going to benefit me? It may very well benefit you down the line, but if you go with the intention of that reciprocal connection. Something may come out of that. So I'm interested to find out the fact that you're a mom of twins. Have you seen this at play in the fact that they've always had each other? That's their foundational network. What have you seen in your family structure when it comes to relationships and networking?
No, well, I mean, to your earlier point around networking being learned, I think that my children have witnessed me acting as a connector. So often, as I was driving them to school in the car, I'm on the car phone and clients are phoning me and saying, we need someone to do this job. I often am an unofficial recruiter. It's not what I do, but because we train a lot of people, I can see talent in organizations. So people will say, who do you recommend for this? Or so they've watched me connect people. And as a result, they have become connectors. So, and they know the power of it, and they know the power of their brand. So, I always think if young people can get that at the beginning of their careers, know that if you switch off your camera on every meeting,
Yes.
you're going to become invisible. So your brand is the essence of you, and how you respond to your emails, how you dress, how you speak. Are you punctual? Do you get back to people? All of those things, they go towards building up or breaking down your brand. So we've often had very robust branding discussions in our house. And I've seen that both of them have learned that and are busy, they're both working now and they use those skills, and because they are very useful.
So being that your husband is an introvert and you're an extrovert, does one twin take after each parent?
So he's not their dad.
Okay.
It's my second husband, but their father is probably more introverted. But I think, to your earlier point about being an ambivert, 73% of the world's population are ambiverts. And
Wow. Okay.
so only 17% of on either side are
True to
yes, or 23%, sorry, are true introverts and extroverts. So a lot depends on your work. So for example, if I am an introvert but I speak for a living,
Yes.
then I would need a lot of downtime after that, because introversion and extroversion is not outgoing or shy.
Yes.
It's actually about where you get your energy from.
Correct.
And extroverts don't need as much alone time as what introverts do.
The subsets that you've looked at for your research and moving in these circles that you have been in terms of your networking organization that you've started, do you find that there's cultural elements to it as well? You've lived overseas as well. Are we who we are innately, or are there influences that can occur in terms of your environment?
No, I definitely have noticed big cultural differences, and often you'll find connectors. So connectors are Uber networkers. They are people who will go out of their way to connect you to somebody else. Because people talk about their problems, and if someone is a connector, they'll be like, oh, you need to speak to you.
I've got a solution.
Exactly.
Yes.
So connectors, I've noticed, flourish in smaller communities, and they're definitely more male connectors than there are females in business anyway. Women often do it more in their social capacity. So, for example, we'll share information about where the best schools are for our children, who the best gynecologist is in your area. So we share black book information, but we often don't do it in business as much as men do. So that's one cultural difference I've observed. I've also observed that men who come from smaller communities, so for example, the Indian community in South Africa, especially people who've got roots in KZN, there's a very robust, because it's a smaller community and they help each other. So there's a lot of, if you need something, go and speak to this one and go and speak to that one. In the Jewish community too. So you often find, in kind of the suburbs where people have got big walls and big, networking is not as prevalent, whereas in smaller communities, a lot of black guys from townships, where people would actively help each other, then, you find that those networks are very powerful.
You also just come across each other a lot more often because you're not so...
behind your high walls.
Yes. So you're walking in the street together, you're in public transportation together. Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic there as well. I think ultimately we need to accept that we don't need to change. It's about adding value and empowering yourself and reading up on how you feel about yourself as well. reading your book would be a great first start. I wanted to just check what is the next avenue that you're busy with in terms of the networking, but are you busy with any more material? Where can we see a lot more of your stuff?
So I'm going to release an online course next year on networking for introverts, because a lot of people have been asking for that. So, I've been studying the subject for nearly 20 years. So, and what's interesting is it always gets more interesting, because I think a lot of things changed over COVID. And I also
Absolutely.
see with the Gen Zs and these Gen Alphas that are now starting to come through school, a lot of them battle with the face-to-face interaction. So it's one of the themes we've seen with our grad programs that we run, is they're much more comfortable sending a WhatsApp or an email.
Yeah.
They don't like picking up the phone or seeing someone
It's very
face to
exposing.
face.
Yeah.
So, I think that in fact the skill has become even more important than it was, whereas there was an ease with maybe the baby boomers and Gen Xers in terms of face-to-face interaction, where there's a lot of anxiety now with young people. So I think that we will always be teaching the skill because it's very needed. And the earlier you get it, the more successful often you're going to be in your career.
Helen, in the digital age, there's a lot more access to people and you can find out a lot more information. How does that translate into the way that we network, and how can we benefit from having this much access? So it feels like we're closer than ever, but in some ways that we're also a little bit apart. How does the digital influence spearhead the way that you want to network?
So I think the your digital presence or research can provide very valuable information about people who you want to connect to. So I think it's a both and. So you can do your research and find out about this person, and also find out who the right person to speak to. So you can do some targeting, you can do some research in the digital space. But then I think, you can't just stay being a keyboard warrior.
Yeah.
You've actually got to often move to the working stage. I always say to my single girlfriends, this person is not going to arrive on your DSTV decoder. You've got to get out there and
Why not?
meet them face to face. So I think the two complement each other. And I think the more deep research you do in the digital space, then immediately by the time you actually get to meet that person, then you can have a deeper connection because you already have done your homework.
There's a school of people, though, who prefer not to have an online footprint and kind of think this stuff is for the birds. Is it important, actually, that we all just gear up to the fact that this is the world that we live in, get a profile, build a digital footprint, because it's necessary for the networking aspect as well?
So I think, you've got to be strategic. If you are uncomfortable from a privacy or whatever perspective, then I wouldn't do Instagram or Facebook. But I think you do need to do LinkedIn if you are a professional person who wants to have your personal brand taken seriously, because that is the marketplace. It almost is the supermarket of the corporate world.
Yes.
So, if you're not present there, and in fact, we had a delegate on one of our programs last year who within her organization did not get a role because they said her LinkedIn profile hadn't been updated. And to them, it sent a message that it meant she didn't take her personal brand seriously enough.
Wow.
And that was within the same organization. It wasn't even. So I think you become a no-name brand if you are nowhere to be found. So I think you've got to find a way in which you can use your social media presence to authentically portray who you are, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. And I think it's an experimentation phase. I think if you adopt a curiosity mentality, then you can find a way that LinkedIn can work for you.
Authentic, I think, is the key word there. Is there a right way to do LinkedIn, and some things that we should avoid? Just because I think there's practical insights that help you thinking, if I'm really just somebody who is wanting to have my resume on the internet, but I don't really know how to engage with the platform, maybe there's some missteps that people have and some tips that you can give as to how you can be your most authentic self.
So I think you've got to take your elevator pitch, which is, that one sentence version of who you are and what you do. And that should be at the top of your LinkedIn profile. And the bottom line is thinking, what can I do for someone else? It's not a place where you just cut and paste your CV and you put it in there.
Yeah.
I think you've got to adopt the same networking philosophy that I spoke about earlier, of one of abundance and one of offering value. So you must always think, what have I learned that I can share? What article have I read that I think was interesting? And then give your viewpoint. So you should always be thinking, what can I give, not what can I get? I'm very put off by people on LinkedIn who immediately connect with me and then try and sell me something.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, it's I think it's cheesy. I think it's the modern day version of the snake oil salesman.
Yeah.
You know, because I want to have trusted advisors in my life. And for me, trust takes time to develop. So it's got to be, you've got to do some courting and dating without, you know, getting married on the first date.
And don't overwhelm people as well. Speaking about how it can assist you, it's not only for external validation people obviously are looking for different career journeys on these platforms as well, but internally in terms of your organizations, it can also create a little bit of depth, and you can maybe develop some cachet as well. Maybe think of this quote that's on the back of your book here that says, "I'm really good at what I do, yet no one other than my direct boss knows how good I am. I over-rely on my technical expertise, which I increasingly realize is not enough. I hate going to functions and I don't want to be seen as the schmoozer. I know I'm better than this, yet my career position or salary isn't reflecting it." So some of these platforms can maybe assist us with people seeing different sides of you as well. But please, can you speak to the person who said this quote and what it means to build a personal brand and the tools that you refer to within the book?
You know, one of the things I think that is a big career mistake that people make is when they take all their personal branding eggs and put it in their line manager's basket. So in other words, they have a good relationship with their line manager and they're only reporting their accomplishments or what they're up to that person, because that person could leave, or that person may not be have a vested interest in your development. So you've got to identify who are the broad stakeholders that need to know about the value that you're bringing to the organization, and having casual conversations in a very newsy way. So you're not being arrogant or boastful, but in the corridor you're going, I just want to let you know what I'm up to. These are some of the things I'm working at. So you're planting those seeds with other people other than your line manager, because that is a very narrow and linear strategy. And often I've seen people really, they come to a real career kind of roadblock when they do that.
Because you could be a workhorse, you could be putting in more hours than everyone else, but if you are the only person who knows that, or a very small group of people, how do you actually get yourself out of that?
And that's why personal branding is the why, to understand that, and then networking is the how. Networking is the way in which you communicate your value to your stakeholders. And that's why, you know, you'll see in the book, 60% of the book is around your personal brand, because that's actually the more complex, nuanced part of it, because it's uncovering the secret source of you. Whereas networking is, you know, they're very deliberate and finite strategies on how to do that. The personal branding place is where I always advise people to start, because that's a lot more tricky. But if you get that right and you're starting in clarity about what makes you unique versus someone who does exactly the same role in the insurance industry, who has, you know, worked for a similar organization. So there's so many similarities in terms of your role, but what distinguishes the two of you? And that distinguishing is your personal brand. And when you start uncovering that secret source of you, then people start to pick that up, and then you communicate that value through your network.
They go hand in hand. You can be extremely technical, but without a personal brand that's developing and quite strong, and you understanding your authentic self, they really do have to complement each other as opposed to work against each other.
Exactly.
You've mentioned coffee stains before. What is this concept of a coffee stain?
So, you know, one day I was flying from Joburg to Cape Town, and the tray table in the airplane flopped down. And I suddenly thought, and there was a big coffee stain on that tray table. And I'd gone from feeling safe on that airplane to feeling unsafe, because I realized that they hadn't cleaned the inside of the airplane. And if they hadn't cleaned the inside of the airplane, maybe they hadn't checked the engine. So that one, you know, that one coffee stain suddenly made me go from feeling safe to unsafe. It's the same thing as if you go to a restaurant and you walk through the kitchen and to go to the bathroom and you see that the kitchen is very dirty. Immediately that's a coffee stain on that restaurant's brand, because then immediately it makes you distrust the quality of the food. And we have, if you apply that same concept to us as personal brands, we have coffee stains on our personal brands. Like, for example, mine a couple of years ago was email. I was always a one-finger typist, and people said to me, you're this networking branding person or expert, and we email you and we don't hear from you. And I realized that your coffee stain often can be a behavior that we think is just who we are, but it can actually really negatively impact, things like being late, things, if you don't look the part, if you talk too much, talk too little, if there are a whole lot of behaviors that can affect your brand, your voice.
Yeah.
And I found your LinkedIn profile, for example, could be a coffee stain. And I always advise people, find out what theirs is and fix it, because you are more than your coffee stain. Because often when you're up for promotions, people will talk about your coffee stains. They'll say, oh, Helen, she's the one who's always late. Or, oh, she's the one who never replies to my email. Or, oh, she's not on LinkedIn. And we are more than that. So find out what yours is and fix it. Other people will often identify it before we do.
A lot of it takes bravery as well, because you have to be brave enough to be transparent with yourself, to see some of this stuff and be prepared to accept it, to say that this is actually something that I've been enacted before, but I'd like to challenge myself to maybe change some of these things at the same time. I've got to start thinking about mine. Yeah. I'm trying to think about which are the ones that really grind not only myself and other people, but introspection is necessary as well. I wanted to do some rapid fire questions with you, Helen. So we are in the business of specialty. Is there any specific specialty that you feel that you have in your life?
So I've done a lot of work around this, really finding what my unique ability is.
Your niches.
And I believe I'm good at three things. All my superpowers are three things. I can speak, I can write, and I can sell and consult and solve clients' problems. So I try and align my time with those three things. And anything that doesn't fall into those three categories, I don't do.
What is your favorite place that you've traveled to?
I think that's such an interesting question. I think Vietnam.
Wow.
Loved Vietnam. Love the food, love the people.
Yes. What is the first thing that you think about when you wake up in the morning?
I try to have a slow start to the day, so I don't turn on my phone immediately. I meditate. So I go and have a cup of tea, I stay at the garden, I meditate for 15 minutes, and then I switch on my phone. So I try and calm my brain down, and I give myself some time to just get into the day. I don't like rushed starts to the day.
Agree. I dawdle. It takes me so long to get out the house, but I give myself the time to do it. And the last question is, who are the people who have had a great influence on you becoming Helen today?
So I think a lot of my teachers at school, they, I think we had a history teacher, and I was at school in 85, 86. Those are my high school years. I matriculated in 87. And at that stage, there was a kind of very little information about apartheid. And we had a history teacher who told us what was actually going on in the country. And, when a lot of children who were at schools, white children in my era, did not know that stuff. And so I had a insight into stuff that was very powerful in terms of I realized I wanted to be part of a change in our country. So I think teachers, and I think my grandmothers. One of my grandmothers was married 7 times. She had
Not
5
Elizabeth
husbands.
Taylor.
No. 2 of them she married twice, but she was a character. And my other granny was very brave, so they were formidable women. And I feel them. They are my ancestors that literally sit right here and guide me. So I think they have made me who I am.
Definitely feels as if you're walking exactly within their footsteps, taking this bold step to not only be an author, but to assist so many people within their lives become their best self. So looking forward to whatever you have next on your path. And thank you for the time today.
Thank you.